Tonight, we're stepping into a world with no dragons, no gleaming armor, and no battlefield that you can find on any ordinary map. The world we're entering tonight is quieter than that, and in many ways far stranger. It is a world of locked filing cabinets and whispered instructions, of men in ordinary suits who changed the course of history without their names ever appearing in a newspaper. It is the world of the Central Intelligence Agency. And whether you're curled up in the dark right now, your eyes already growing heavy, or lying still and listening to the low hum of the night around you, this is a story that asks very little of you, except your attention, and only for as long as you can hold it. The CIA is one of the most written about, most debated, most mythologized institutions in American history. And yet the more you learn about it, the more you realize how much remains in the shadows. That is what we're here for tonight. Not the Hollywood version, not the spy thriller. Just the slow, careful, atmospheric truth, or as much of it as has ever been allowed to come to light. Before we go any further, a quiet moment for the channel. If these slow historical stories help you drift off at night, it would mean the world to me if you liked this video and subscribed to Heyo. My goal right now is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one counts more than you know. If you have a comment to leave, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is on your clock. And if you have even a little sleepy hype left to send this way, please do. It keeps this peaceful little corner of history alive. Now, let's begin. Section 1. A shadow agency born from shadows. Picture the world in the summer of 1945. The war in Europe has ended. The war in the Pacific will end within weeks. And the United States, exhausted and triumphant in equal measure, is trying to figure out what comes next. The men and women who had spent years running espionage operations in Nazi-occupied territory, forging documents, recruiting informants, running agents behind enemy lines, those people suddenly have no institution to call home, because the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime spy agency that had given them their mission and their cover, was being shut down. President Harry Truman signed the order in September of 1945. He dissolved the OSS with the casual confidence of a man who didn't think he would need it anymore. The war was over. Peacetime was coming. The United States, in Truman's thinking at the time, had no particular need for a permanent, institutionalized spy agency. That was the kind of thing that felt vaguely un-American, vaguely European, vaguely at odds with the ideals of a democracy that prided itself on transparency and due process. So the OSS was disbanded, its files scattered among various government departments, its personnel sent home or reassigned. Within a year, Truman had completely changed his mind. What changed it was the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not something that arrived with a formal announcement. It crept in gradually, like a draft under a closed door. Soviet troops were not going home from Eastern Europe. Soviet influence was spreading into countries that the United States had assumed would naturally fall into the Western orbit. and American intelligence, such as it was, felt fragmented, slow, and dangerously behind. In the words of those close to the situation at the time, the United States was behind the game. The Soviets had been running covert operations for decades. America was, in many ways, starting from scratch.
The debate about what to do about this was not simple. Military leaders didn't want a civilian agency with that kind of reach. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, jealously guarded its own intelligence turf and deeply resented the idea of a rival. Members of Congress worried about funding an organization that would operate in secret, beyond easy oversight. And there was the deeply uncomfortable question that nobody quite wanted to say out loud. Could a democracy sustain a permanent secret service without that secret service eventually turning its tools on the democracy itself? These concerns did not go away, but the Cold War was accelerating faster than the debates, and on July 26, 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. That act did many things. It unified the military branches under a single Department of Defense. It created the National Security Council, and buried within its language, it established the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was designed, at least on paper, to be a coordinating body, a place where intelligence gathered by various agencies could be collected, analyzed, and presented to the president and his senior advisors. It was not supposed to have domestic law enforcement powers. It was not supposed to operate inside the United States. It was a civilian agency, reporting to the president through the National Security Council, focused entirely on the foreign world. That was the design. The reality would turn out to be considerably more complex.
The first few years of the CIA's existence were, by many accounts, a period of genuine organizational confusion. Its early directors struggled to define the agency's mission. Its first director, Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, was a steady, if uninspiring figure who found himself presiding over an agency that wasn't quite sure what it was for. The various intelligence arms of the military branches resisted sharing information with the new civilian agency. The State Department was suspicious of it, and the agency's own mandate kept expanding in ways that its founders may not have fully anticipated. The pivotal moment came in 1948, when the CIA was formally authorized to conduct covert operations, not just intelligence gathering, covert operations. That meant the ability to act secretly in foreign countries, to fund political movements, to run propaganda, to support friendly governments and undermine unfriendly ones. This was a profound expansion of the agency's original mission, and it happened quietly, in the language of classified policy directives, far from any public debate. The man who would come to define that covert action mission in the early years was not a cautious bureaucrat. His name was Frank Wisner. He was a lawyer, a World War II veteran who had served in the OSS, and a man of enormous energy and ambition. Wisner was not particularly interested in espionage in the traditional sense, in the patient gathering and careful analysis of foreign intelligence. He was interested in shaping events, in making things happen. He believed, with the passionate certainty of a true believer, that America's intelligence service could do in the Cold War what the OSS had done in the Hot One, reach into foreign countries and change the balance of power.
That belief, and the institutional culture it helped create, would set the CIA on a path that would bring it to the heights of daring ingenuity and to the depths of catastrophic moral failure, sometimes in the same year, sometimes in the same operation. The early CIA also struggled with something more fundamental, the simple problem of actually getting good intelligence.
The Soviet Union was one of the most closed and impenetrable societies on Earth. Recruiting agents inside it was extraordinarily difficult. Signals intelligence was limited, and the men running the agency were, for all their confidence, largely improvising. They had the money, the authority, and the patriotic conviction. What they didn't always have was accurate information, reliable sources, or any reliable way to tell the difference between a genuine intelligence success and an elaborate Soviet deception. Still, the agency grew. By the early 1950s, the CIA had become a significant and deeply embedded part of the American national security apparatus. It had its own budget, its own training facilities, its own culture, and its own set of loyalties that sometimes sat uneasily alongside the loyalties demanded by the democratic government it served. And somewhere in those early corridors, in the hum of classified typewriters and the flicker of conference room fluorescent lights, the shadow world was taking shape. The story of what happened next is strange enough and dark enough to carry us through a long, quiet night.
The early CIA operated from a cluster of temporary buildings on the National Mall in Washington, a physical arrangement that reflected its institutional impermanence. It was not until 1961 that the agency moved into its permanent headquarters facility in Langley, Virginia, a modern complex of buildings set back from the Potomac River in the wooded Virginia suburbs. The campus was designed to be anonymous from the outside, easily mistaken for a corporate headquarters or a federal administrative building. The only clue to what it housed was, and still is, the seal embedded in the lobby floor, the eagle, the compass rose, and the 16-pointed star that serve as the CIA's emblem, above the inscription that identifies it as the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. The early personnel of the CIA were drawn heavily from a particular social world. The OSS had been famously elite, staffed in large part by Ivy League graduates, lawyers, academics, and professionals with the kind of social connections and language skills that Cold War intelligence work seemed to require. The early CIA perpetuated this culture. Allen Dulles himself had attended Princeton and joined a law firm. His colleagues had attended Harvard and Yale and Columbia. They knew each other from prep schools and clubs and shared summer communities in New England. This social homogeneity had real operational consequences. It meant the agency had a relatively narrow range of perspectives, a shared set of assumptions about the world and about American interests that went largely unquestioned, and a tendency to trust the judgment of insiders over the evidence produced by the messy realities of the countries they were supposed to understand.
It also meant the agency had remarkable esprit de corps, at least in its early years. People who worked there felt they were part of something important and exclusive. The secrecy that surrounded their work, the sense of being privy to knowledge that ordinary citizens could not access, was itself a kind of compensation. You were not allowed to tell your family what you did. You were not allowed to talk about your work at dinner parties. But you knew, in the way that only insiders can know, that the work mattered. Whether it mattered in the ways the people doing it believed it did, whether the price paid in moral compromise and institutional corruption was proportionate to the benefits accrued, is the question that echoes through the entire history of the agency. It is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. The story of what happened next is strange enough and dark enough to carry us through a long, quiet night. But before we follow the CIA into the Cold War operations that defined its public reputation, there is one more foundational story to tell, one that begins not with a spy agency, but with a defeated army, and with the question of what a nation is willing to do with the knowledge its enemies produced, even when that knowledge was produced through unspeakable cruelty. Section 2. Operation Paperclip, the Nazi scientists America quietly imported.
Here is a detail that tends to make people pause when they first hear it. After the Second World War, as American soldiers were still walking through the ruins of Nazi concentration camps, as the Nuremberg trials were being assembled to prosecute German war criminals, a quiet and highly classified American government program was doing something that seems almost impossible to reconcile with those events. It was actively recruiting former Nazi scientists, engineers, and medical researchers, scrubbing their records of the worst of what they had done, and bringing them to the United States to continue their work under American government sponsorship. The program was called Operation Paperclip, and though it predates the formal founding of the CIA played a central role in its continuation and its cover-up, and its legacy shaped the agency's willingness in the years that followed to work with morally compromised sources when strategic interest seemed to demand it. The logic behind Operation Paperclip, such as it was, began in the final months of the war in Europe. American military and intelligence officials were becoming acutely aware that German science had, in several critical areas, outpaced Allied science. The German V-2 rocket program, directed by Wernher von Braun, had produced the world's first operational ballistic missiles. German research into jet propulsion, into high-altitude atmospheric effects, into chemical and biological agents was in many cases years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. And as the war ended, there was a frantic race between the United States and the Soviet Union to capture not just German territory, but German knowledge. The American program began under a different name, Operation Overcast, before becoming Operation Paperclip. Its mechanism was both simple and deeply troubling. German scientists of value to American military and intelligence interests were located, their backgrounds were assessed, and if they were deemed useful enough, their records were altered. Specifically, their documented affiliations with the Nazi Party, with the SS, with programs that had used slave labor or conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners, were minimized or erased. A new file was prepared, and the scientist was brought to the United States. Wernher von Braun is probably the most famous example. He was a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, and the V-2 rocket program he led had relied on slave labor from concentration camps, with thousands of prisoners dying during the production of those rockets. After the war, his records were quietly revised. He came to America, worked for the United States Army, and eventually became the central figure in NASA's program to reach the moon. He was celebrated as a hero of the space age. But the paperclip scientists were not all rocket engineers. Some of them had been involved in far darker work. General Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Nazi Army, had approved experiments in the concentration camps at Auschwitz and Dachau. He was initially brought to the United States under paperclip before public pressure eventually forced his departure. His brief presence, however, was itself significant, because among the projects he was consulted on was the CIA's early mind control research, which we'll return to in a later section.
The CIA's role in Paperclip involved more than just providing cover stories and altered files. The agency served as one of the institutional homes for some of the scientists brought over, and it absorbed the research methodologies, the willingness to conduct human experiments without consent, and the moral flexibility that characterized some of the darkest corners of Nazi science. The doctrine that extraordinary strategic goals could justify extraordinary means, that the rules applying to ordinary human conduct could be suspended when the stakes were high enough, was not invented by the CIA, but it found a comfortable home there. Operation Paperclip officially ended in 1955, though related recruitment efforts continued for years afterward. By that point, well over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought to the United States under its auspices. Their contributions to American rocket technology, aerospace research, and military capability were significant and, in some cases, irreplaceable. NASA's Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that carried American astronauts to the moon, was in many ways the product of German engineering expertise imported under this program. The deception required to make the program work was multi-layered and deliberate. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the body that administered the program, worked directly with American immigration and State Department officials to override the normal visa restrictions that would have barred people with documented Nazi affiliations from entering the United States. When a scientist's background was too conspicuous to simply paper over, the papers themselves were altered, affiliations erased, ranks minimized, dates changed. President Truman had specifically directed that no one who had been a member of the Nazi Party or had been found to have participated in activities against the United States should be admitted. The intelligence community's response was to redefine the records so that the prohibition did not technically apply. Arthur Rudolph, for instance, was a senior figure in the V-2 rocket program who had directly supervised the use of slave labor from the Dora concentration camp, where approximately 20,000 prisoners died during the production of V-2 rockets. His records were sanitized. He came to the United States, worked for the Army, and eventually became the project director for the Saturn V rocket program at NASA. He was never prosecuted. He renounced his American citizenship in 1984 under pressure from the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, which had been investigating Nazi war criminals in the United States, and returned to Germany, where he died in 1996.
George Rickey was brought over under Paperclip and was actually indicted by an American military tribunal in Germany for his role in the use of slave labor. The indictment was quietly dropped after he was already in the United States. Hubertus Strughold was known as the father of space medicine and oversaw American research into the physiological effects of space travel, but he had been listed in Nuremberg trial documents as a participant in conferences discussing medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. The records in his paperclip file described him as having no Nazi Party affiliation. This was false. The moral complexity at the center of Paperclip was not lost on everyone at the time. The State Department repeatedly objected. Some members of Congress raised concerns. Jewish organizations protested. But the Cold War logic was decisive. The Soviet Union was also recruiting German scientists, and any German expertise not captured by the West might end up in Soviet hands. The decision was made again and again that the strategic value outweighed the moral cost. And yet the program left a stain that has never quite washed out. Because what it demonstrated in those early post-war years when the CIA was still finding its feet was that the American intelligence community was capable of making choices that prioritized strategic advantage over justice, over accountability, over the principles that the war had ostensibly been fought to defend. That lesson was not lost, and it echoed forward into the decades that followed, showing up again and again in the choices the CIA made when confronted with the tension between its ideals and its goals. Settle in a little deeper now. Let the weight of your blanket rest on your shoulders. The night is long, and the story is just beginning.
By the early 1950s, the
the CIA had settled into something resembling a shape. It had directors who understood the political landscape. It had a budget that, while classified, was substantial. It had personnel drawn from the cream of American universities and the veterans of the OSS, men and women who were smart, well-connected, and deeply motivated by a conviction that they were fighting for something important. And it had, in Alan Dulles, the man who became director in 1953, one of the most charismatic and ambitious figures the intelligence world had ever produced. Alan Dulles was the brother of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a fact that gave the CIA unusual proximity to the highest levels of foreign policy. He was a veteran of both World Wars, a former OSS station chief in Bern, and a man who genuinely loved the work of espionage with the enthusiasm of a person who had found his natural element. He smoked a pipe, he told wonderful stories, he cultivated an image of calm, patrician authority that made him enormously effective in the cocktail parties and Washington dinner tables where Cold War strategy was so often actually discussed. He called his covert operators the Great White Case Officers, and he believed in them with a conviction that sometimes outran the evidence supporting it.
The culture that defined the CIA's covert action wing in these years was shaped above all by Frank Wisner, whose name we encountered in the first section. Wisner ran the agency's covert operations through the late 1940s and 1950s with an almost manic energy. He believed with complete conviction that the United States could use covert action to roll back Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, to keep wavering governments in the Western camp, to fund friendly political parties, to undermine hostile ones. He called the CIA's covert action capabilities his mighty Wurlitzer, a reference to the mighty theater organs of the era, suggesting that with the right resources he could play the world like an instrument. The problem, as journalist Tim Weiner documented in his exhaustive history of the CIA, was that the intelligence Wisner was working with was often unreliable or outright wrong. In the early 1950s, Wisner ran operations in Eastern Europe that were based on a fundamental misreading of the situation on the ground. The CIA recruited, trained, and inserted agents into countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Albania, believing that there were genuine resistance movements waiting to be activated, populations ready to rise against Soviet-backed governments. They were largely wrong. Many of the agents they recruited turned out to be double agents, already working for Soviet or local intelligence. The resistance networks were compromised or imaginary, and the men and women who were sent in, recruited at great effort and sent behind the Iron Curtain with promises of American support, were in many cases captured, tortured, and killed.
In Albania, for instance, the CIA and British intelligence jointly ran an operation called Operation Valuable that attempted to insert agents who would make contact with resistance groups and eventually trigger an uprising against the communist government of Enver Hoxha. The operation was compromised almost from the beginning. Kim Philby, the British intelligence officer who served as the liaison between British intelligence and the CIA on the operation, was later revealed to be a Soviet agent, one of the famous Cambridge 5 spy ring. He had been passing details of the operation to the Soviets throughout. The agents who were inserted were met, arrested, and in most cases killed. The operation was a disaster that cost lives and produced nothing. The failure in Albania was not unique. Similar operations in Poland, in Romania, and in other Eastern European countries followed the same pattern. Agents inserted, networks compromised, operations collapsed. The CIA knew, in general terms, that something was going wrong, But the institutional culture made it extremely difficult to acknowledge that the problem might be systemic, might be rooted in the basic premise of the operations rather than in the execution of any individual mission.
Wisner himself eventually broke down. The mental and emotional cost of running operations that sent men to their deaths, of believing that he was changing the world and then watching the world not change, took a devastating toll. By the late 1950s, he was suffering from what was diagnosed as psychotic manic depression. He was hospitalized, treated with electroconvulsive therapy, and eventually returned to work in diminished capacity. He resigned from the CIA in 1962 and took his own life in 1965. His story is one of the most tragic in the agency's history. A man of extraordinary gifts, destroyed in part by his own convictions and the institution he had done so much to build. What these men, Dulles, Wisner, Bissell, and their colleagues created in the early CIA was an institution with an enormous appetite for action, a deep suspicion of caution, and a habit of convincing itself that whatever it was doing was not only necessary, but righteous. The Cold War provided the moral framework. Soviet expansion was genuinely dangerous. Communist ideology posed real challenges to American interests. The men of the CIA were not, by and large, cynics. They believed in what they were doing. But belief, as the history of the CIA demonstrates with uncomfortable regularity, is not the same as judgment. And the conviction that you are fighting for civilization can lead you to do things that civilization would not otherwise sanction. By the early 1950s, the tools were in place, the doctrine was established, the budget was flowing, and the first major test of whether covert action could change history was about to begin in a country that most Americans had barely heard of, over a commodity that the modern world could not live without. Section 4, Operation Ajax, the coup that changed everything. The year is 1951. In Tehran, the capital of Iran, a 69-year-old politician with a long, mournful face and an unexpectedly powerful political base has just become prime minister. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh, and he is about to make a decision that will set in motion a chain of events stretching all the way to the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and beyond. Consequences that the world still lives with today. The decision Mossadegh made was to nationalize Iran's oil industry. To understand why this was such a flashpoint, you have to understand a little history. Since 1908, Iran's oil had been extracted and controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation that had been granted its original concession by a compliant Persian government in 1901. The arrangement was deeply inequitable. Iran received a modest royalty, while Britain and its shareholders captured the vast majority of the profits from one of the richest oil fields in the world. Iranian workers at the refineries in Abadan labored in conditions that were, by most accounts, harsh and exploitative, with few of the benefits that accrued to the British and other Western employees. Mossadegh argued with considerable popular support that Iran's oil belonged to Iran. He pushed the nationalization bill through parliament and became enormously popular with the Iranian public in the process. The British government was outraged. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company lobbied furiously. The British organized an international boycott of Iranian oil that essentially cut Iran off from its export revenues, and they began approaching the Americans about doing something more direct. Initially, the Truman administration was reluctant. American officials were not unsympathetic to the idea that a country had the right to control its own natural resources. There were also American companies who noted with some satisfaction that knocking out the British-controlled oil company might create opportunities for American oil interests. Truman's State Department was cautious. Then Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953. His administration was less cautious, and Allen Dulles, newly installed as CIA director, was deeply receptive to the British proposal.
The British had framed Mossadegh, not entirely accurately, as a communist fellow traveller who was opening the door to Soviet influence in Iran. This was the language that resonated most powerfully in Washington in 1953, the year the Korean War was still being fought and Senator McCarthy was at the height of his influence. The fear of communist expansion, whether or not it accurately described the specific situation on the ground, was enough to provide the moral and political justification for what came next. The plan was called Operation Ajax on the American side and Operation Boot on the British side. Its architect on the CIA side was a man named Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a skilled and experienced intelligence officer, and the operation he ran was a textbook example of what covert intervention could look like when it was organized, funded, and ruthlessly executed. The method was not an assassination or a military strike. It was something more subtle, the manufactured appearance of a popular uprising. CIA money flowed into Tehran to bribe politicians, military officers, and religious leaders. Newspaper editors were paid to publish anti-Mossadegh stories. Clerics were paid to denounce him from their pulpits. Organized gangs were hired to create the impression of pro-Shah, anti-Mossadegh street protests. False rumors were planted. Propaganda was distributed. The goal was to make the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had been installed on the throne in 1941 and was at this point a fairly weak and indecisive figure, feel confident enough to dismiss Mossadegh and appoint a CIA-friendly replacement. The first attempt failed. In mid-August 1953, the Shah signed the order dismissing Mossadegh, but the general appointed to carry it out was arrested instead. The Shah, panicking, fled the country. It looked briefly as if the operation had collapsed. It had not. Roosevelt remained in Tehran and continued to press. More money was distributed, more pressure was applied to key military figures. And on August 19, 1953, coordinated crowds, many of them paid and organized by CIA money, filled the streets of Tehran. Pro-Shah army units moved. Mossadegh's supporters were overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran had been removed from office, arrested, and ultimately placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah returned, and Iran was, once again, safely in the Western column. In Washington, the operation was celebrated as a brilliant success. It had cost relatively little money, perhaps $147,500 in direct CIA funding by some accounts, with broader covert support running higher. It had achieved its objective quickly, and it had demonstrated that the CIA's covert action toolkit could topple governments. The celebrations were premature.
The Shah's regime, propped up by Western support and increasingly dependent on a brutal secret police force called Savak, trained and assisted in part by the CIA and Israel's Mossad, became progressively more authoritarian over the following decades. Resentment of the United States, rooted in the memory of the 1953 coup, ran deep in Iranian society. When the revolution finally came in 1979, its targets were not just the Shah and his government. They were also the American embassy, which revolutionary students seized and held for 444 days, because in the minds of many Iranians, that embassy had been the command center for the original betrayal of their democracy.
The coup in Iran became a template. Its apparent ease and success encouraged the CIA to export the model elsewhere. Guatemala was next, then Chile, then in more complex and varied forms across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Each operation had its own specifics, its own justifications, its own cast of characters, but the essential shape was the same: a government inconvenient to American interests, a covert operation to remove it, and consequences that played out over years and decades in ways the planners had not fully considered and sometimes could not have imagined. Section 5. Guatemala and the Playbook Perfected. Less than a year after Mossadegh was removed from power in Tehran, the CIA applied a very similar approach to a very different country on a very different continent. Guatemala in 1954 was a small Central American nation with a large indigenous population, a history of poverty and inequality, and, as of 1951, a democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had implemented a land reform program. Under its terms, large tracts of uncultivated land, including land owned by wealthy Guatemalan landlords, and significantly, approximately 160,000 acres belonging to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation, were redistributed to landless peasants. The Guatemalan government compensated the United Fruit Company based on the value the company itself had declared on its tax filings, which turned out to be considerably less than what the company now claimed the land was worth. This made the company very unhappy.
The United Fruit Company was not without resources. It had deep connections in Washington, including a well-connected public relations man named Edward Bernays, and direct relationships with senior figures in the Eisenhower administration. Both Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles had in their careers done legal work connected to the company or its interests. The argument the company made, and that its allies in Washington amplified, was that Arbenz's land reform was evidence of communist influence, that Guatemala was becoming a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. This argument was, by most careful historical assessments, an exaggeration at best. Arbenz was a nationalist and a reformer. The Guatemalan Communist Party was small and had limited actual influence on his government, though some communists did hold low-level positions. But the Eisenhower administration's determination to see the situation through the lens of Cold War ideological conflict meant that the nuances were set aside. The decision to remove Arbenz was made. The operation was called PBSU Success. It began in September 1952 when the CIA initiated a program to train, arm, and prepare a small force of anti-Arbenz rebels under a colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas. Training camps were established in Honduras and Nicaragua. Arms were stockpiled. A radio station was set up to broadcast propaganda into Guatemala under the guise of being a Guatemalan rebel station. Psychological operations were planned in elaborate detail, designed to create the impression of a massive popular movement against Arbenz, when in reality the force being assembled was small and not particularly militarily capable.
The key to the operation was not the rebel army. It was the psychological campaign designed to convince Arbenz, the Guatemalan military, and the Guatemalan public that the rebel force was larger and more powerful than it actually was. CIA aircraft flew over Guatemalan cities, dropping leaflets and, in carefully staged incidents, appearing to engage in military operations. Radio broadcasts proclaimed the imminent arrival of liberation forces. The goal was to create panic, confusion, and above all, to persuade the Guatemalan military leadership to abandon Arbenz before any serious fighting became necessary. It worked, in a manner of speaking. In June 1954, as the rebel forces crossed the border and CIA planes harassed Guatemalan airfields, the Guatemalan military turned on Arbenz and demanded his resignation. He stepped down. Castillo Armas eventually came to power. Guatemala was back in the acceptable column. The long-term consequences were, as in Iran, significantly darker than the short-term success suggested. Castillo Armas's government was authoritarian and violent. The land reform that had benefited hundreds of thousands of peasants was reversed. Decades of political instability, military coups, and eventually a brutal civil war followed, a conflict that lasted from 1960 to 1996 and cost approximately 200,000 lives, with the majority of victims being indigenous Guatemalans killed by military forces. The CIA's role in creating the conditions for that conflict was never publicly acknowledged, though it has since been extensively documented. The details of what the CIA actually did to prepare the operation are illuminating in their specificity. The propaganda campaign included a clandestine radio station called Radio Liberation that broadcast anti-Arbenz programming into Guatemala, presenting itself as the voice of a Guatemalan resistance movement, when it was in reality a CIA production, scripted and transmitted from outside the country. Fake news bulletins announced troop movements and rebel victories that had not happened. The goal was not primarily to inform, but to demoralize, to make the Guatemalan military believe that they were facing a much larger and more powerful force than actually existed, and that the outcome was already determined. The Dulles brothers, Alan at the CIA and John Foster at the State Department, coordinated the operation with unusual openness in a closed bureaucratic circle. Their dual positions gave the operation an unusual coherence between intelligence action and diplomatic cover. When other Latin American governments expressed concern about what was happening in Guatemala, American diplomats were able to deflect with the confident authority of people who knew exactly what was happening and had decided it was not their concern. Eisenhower approved the final operation in the spring of 1954. He received regular briefings. The operation was not rogue or unauthorized. It was a presidential decision carried out by the CIA with the full knowledge and authority of the commander-in-chief. This is important to emphasize because one of the persistent narratives about CIA covert action in this era is that it was somehow separate from or unknown to the presidents who should have been overseeing it. In Guatemala, at least, the historical record is clear. Eisenhower knew and approved.
Castillo Armas himself was assassinated in 1957 by one of his own presidential guard. The governments that followed were no more stable and considerably more violent. The 1960s brought a guerrilla insurgency that the Guatemalan military, with American assistance, fought through methods that included widespread torture and the massacre of civilian communities suspected of supporting the rebels. The civil war that these conditions produced dragged on for 36 years, and a United Nations-sponsored Truth Commission that examined it in the 1990s concluded that acts of genocide had been committed against indigenous Mayan communities by Guatemalan state forces. The word genocide appears in that report, written in connection with events that trace a direct line back to a CIA operation that was at the time considered one of the agency's cleanest and most successful covert actions.
What PBSU success confirmed for the CIA was the same lesson that Operation Ajax had seemed to teach, that covert action could topple governments, and that the cost in American resources was low. What neither operation had fully taught, or had taught and been ignored, was the lesson about long-term consequences, about the difference between removing a government and actually solving a problem, about the way that covert interventions leave a residue of resentment and instability that can outlast any short-term strategic gain by decades. That lesson would take a long time to absorb. In some ways, it is still being absorbed. Section 6, Project MK-Ultra, the search to control the human mind.
Close your eyes for a moment, if they haven't already drifted shut, and consider something. The human mind, the most complex, most private, most fundamentally inviolate thing that exists. The one place that has always been, in every culture and every era, irreducibly your own. Whatever governments may do to bodies, to property, to freedom of movement, the interior of the mind has always been the last citadel, the place no one else could enter without permission. The CIA spent more than a decade trying to find a key to that citadel. The program that would become MK-Ultra had roots going back to the late 1940s, shortly after the end of the Second World War. American intelligence officials had been troubled by reports, first from the Korean War and then from Soviet bloc countries, that prisoners subjected to interrogation had confessed to things that seemed impossible, or had returned from captivity behaving in ways that suggested their minds had been tampered with. The phrase brainwashing entered the American vocabulary, imported from reports of Chinese techniques applied to American prisoners of war in Korea. And the CIA became convinced that the Soviets and the Chinese had discovered some method, some drug or technique or combination of both that could override a person's will and extract information or worse, implant beliefs. If the enemy had such a capability, the CIA needed to understand it, and if such a capability was possible at all, the CIA needed to develop it first.
The early programs were called Project Bluebird and then Operation Artichoke. They investigated the use of drugs, hypnosis, and other techniques to alter the mental state of interrogation subjects, to produce confusion, to break resistance, to extract information. These programs operated in secret facilities in the United States, in West Germany, and in Japan, and they used subjects who had not consented, prisoners, mental patients, and others who were considered expendable, or whose consent was deemed irrelevant to the mission. In 1953, Alan Dulles reorganized and expanded these programs under the name MK-Ultra. The name was Dulles's own choice, reflecting what he called the program's ultra-sensitive nature. He appointed a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb to run it. Gottlieb was an unusual man, a scientist with a doctorate from Caltech, who also raised Christmas trees on a farm in Virginia and folk danced on weekends. He became, as journalist Stephen Kinzer later described him, the chief poisoner of the CIA, the man who ran what Kinzer called the most sustained search in history for techniques of mind control. MK-Ultra ultimately involved at least 150 research programs conducted at more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and CIA-operated safe houses. The techniques it investigated ranged from hypnosis to electroshock therapy, from sleep deprivation to sensory deprivation, from the administration of barbiturates and other sedatives to the administration of hallucinogenic drugs, most notably LSD. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, had been synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann,
who accidentally discovered its extraordinary psychoactive properties in 1943. The CIA became intensely interested in it. Gottlieb and his team believed that LSD might be the key they were looking for, a drug that would dissolve the boundaries of the self, that would make subjects compliant and suggestible, that would allow trained interrogators to extract information, or, in more ambitious versions of the vision, to implant entirely new patterns of thought and belief. The problem was that LSD did not work that way. It produced dramatic alterations in consciousness, but it did not produce the reliable compliance and suggestibility the CIA was looking for. It produced confusion, terror, ecstasy, and in some cases lasting psychological damage, but it did not produce controllable subjects. These failures were documented in the research, but they did not end the program. Instead, the program expanded. Among the most disturbing aspects of MKUltra was the scale of its unconsented human experimentation. Gottlieb and his team believed that testing under controlled laboratory conditions with willing volunteers who knew they were taking drugs would not produce the authentic results they needed. They needed to know how the drugs would affect people who did not know they were being given them, and so they arranged situations in which unwitting people, American citizens, were dosed with LSD without their knowledge or consent.
The most notorious of these programs was called Operation Midnight Climax. In 1955, the CIA set up a series of safe houses, including a carefully decorated apartment at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco, where CIA employed prostitutes, lured clients, who were then surreptitiously given LSD, while CIA officers watched through two-way mirrors and took notes. The stated purpose was to observe how ordinary people reacted to the drug in real-world conditions. The actual outcome was the systematic drugging of unconsenting American citizens in what amounted to a long-running criminal operation, protected by the CIA's authority and secrecy. The most haunting individual case from this era is that of Frank Olson. Olson was a biochemist who worked for the Army's Special Operations Division and was involved in biological warfare research connected to the CIA's programs. In November 1953, he was surreptitiously given a large dose of LSD without his knowledge during a gathering at a CIA facility in Maryland. He had a severe psychological reaction. He became paranoid and depressed. Several days later, he fell from the window of a New York hotel room and died. The CIA told his family it was a suicide. The truth of what happened to Frank Olson, and whether his death was a genuine suicide or something darker, has never been fully resolved. His family has pursued the case for decades, and the question remains, quietly and persistently, open.
MKUltra also extended to Canada. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted what he called depatterning experiments, funded in part with CIA money channeled through various front organizations. Cameron believed he could erase a patient's existing personality and replace it with a healthier one, a goal he pursued through massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, drug-induced sleep lasting weeks or months, and the repeated playing of recorded messages designed to create new behavioral patterns. His patients were not told what was being done to them. Many of them sustained severe and permanent psychological damage. Some lost large portions of their memories. Families were destroyed. Cameron died in 1967, before the full extent of his work became known and before his victims could seek justice.
Lawsuits against the Canadian government and the CIA continued for decades. The CIA destroyed most of its MK-Ultra records in 1973 on the orders of then-director Richard Helms, who was concerned about the forthcoming congressional investigations. But in 1977, a cache of approximately 20,000 documents that had been misfiled and not destroyed was discovered through a Freedom of Information Act request. Those documents formed the basis of the Senate hearings that same year, in which CIA Director Stansfield Turner told Congress that he was, and these were his words, horrified by what the program had done. The full scope of MK-Ultra is still not known. Because most of the records were destroyed, there are entire subprograms, entire institutions, entire populations of victims whose stories may never be fully recovered. What we know is troubling enough. What we don't know may be more troubling still. Section 7. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA and the Press.
One of the quietest, most persistent, and in some ways most unsettling of the CIA's Cold War programs was not about drugs or coups or submarine recovery. It was about something far more intimate. It was about what you read in the newspaper, what you watched on television, what you heard on the radio, what the journalists you trusted were actually working for. Operation Mockingbird, as it became known, was the CIA's effort to cultivate relationships with American journalists, editors, and media organizations in order to shape the information that the American public received about the Cold War, about foreign policy, and about the CIA itself. The program began in the late 1940s and early 1950s under Frank Wisner, who understood with unusual clarity that in a modern democracy, the battle for public opinion was as important as any battlefield. Wisner and his colleagues believed that the Soviet Union was actively engaged in propaganda operations designed to shape Western public opinion, and that the United States needed to respond in kind. The problem was that overt American government propaganda was neither effective nor desirable. What was needed was influence that looked like independent journalism. The mechanism was relatively straightforward. CIA officers cultivated relationships with journalists who were sympathetic to the agency's mission. Some journalists were simply paid to produce CIA-friendly content. Some were given exclusive access to CIA information on the understanding that they would present it in a favorable light. Some were recruited more formally as actual agents of the CIA with defined relationships, cover stories, and tasks. The key principle was that these relationships were never disclosed to the public, to the journalists' editors or employers, or to anyone outside the small circle of CIA officers managing them. The scale of these relationships, when it was finally investigated in the 1970s, turned out to be larger than most people had imagined. The Church Committee, the Senate investigation we'll discuss in more detail later, found that the CIA had relationships with journalists at many of the most prominent media organizations in the country. The New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, and many others had reporters or editors who were, in various capacities, connected to the CIA. Some of these relationships involved actual agents. Others were looser, involving the sharing of CIA-prepared material as if it were independently gathered journalism. Philip Graham, the publisher of The Washington Post, reportedly cooperated with the CIA in identifying and recruiting journalists for these purposes. Joseph Alsop, one of the most widely read columnists of the post-war era, had a documented relationship with the CIA. Cord Meyer, a CIA officer who himself had once been a journalist and a committed internationalist, ran an influential network of media relationships throughout his career at the agency. The arrangements ranged from the casual, a journalist willing to check a story with the CIA before publishing and agree to soften or drop elements that the CIA found inconvenient, to the formal, journalists who were CIA employees or contract agents and who were producing material specifically for CIA purposes. The CIA also funded and influenced media outlets abroad, which was technically its mandate. It owned or had significant influence over news agencies, newspapers, and radio stations in various countries, which it used to promote narratives favorable to American foreign policy. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, a prestigious organization that funded literary magazines, art exhibitions, and intellectual conferences throughout the Western world, was secretly funded by the CIA. A fact that, when it was revealed in 1967, caused enormous damage to the credibility of the publications and intellectuals it had supported, many of whom had no idea where their funding actually came from. Among the publications the Congress for Cultural Freedom supported were Encounter magazine, the prestigious literary and political journal based in London, Partisan Review in the United States, and a range of other culturally influential outlets. Writers and intellectuals who contributed to these publications, who attended CIA-funded conferences, who received CIA-funded grants and prizes, were in many cases entirely unaware of the source of their support. The revelation that their work had been, however indirectly, part of an American government propaganda effort was deeply disorienting for many of them, and permanently altered the way they thought about the independence of cultural institutions. The domestic dimension of Mockingbird raised profound constitutional questions. The CIA was explicitly prohibited from operating within the United States. Using American journalists as agents or manipulating American media to shape domestic public opinion was a violation not just of the CIA's charter, but of the fundamental principles of a free press. When Senator Frank Church investigated these activities in 1975 and 1976, he described what he found as deeply troubling, a systematic effort to corrupt the information environment on which democratic decision-making depended. The CIA defended some of these practices as necessary tools of Cold War competition. The argument, familiar by now, was that the Soviets were doing the same thing, that the United States needed to fight propaganda with propaganda, that the alternative was to allow Soviet narratives to go unchallenged. Whether or not that argument had merit, the consequence of accepting it was an intelligence agency that had made itself comfortable with deceiving not its enemies, but its own public. The question of how much of this continued after the 1970s reforms is one that has never been fully answered. The Church Committee's investigations led to new regulations and restrictions. Formal CIA relationships with journalists employed by American media organizations were officially terminated. But the informal relationships, the networks of contacts, the habits of information management, the culture of influence, those things are harder to terminate by regulation. And the question of where the line falls between legitimate outreach to journalists and the manipulation of the press remains in the world of intelligence genuinely contested. Section 8. The Bay of Pigs, America's most embarrassing secret. By 1960, the CIA's Covert Action Wing had accumulated what looked from the inside like an impressive record. It had overthrown governments in Iran and Guatemala. It had run aggressive propaganda operations around the world. It had, in the U-2 program, given American presidents unprecedented photographic intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. And it was deeply, almost fatally, confident. The confidence was about to meet its limit. Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba in January 1959, at the head of a revolutionary movement that had spent years in the mountains and jungles fighting against the corrupt and American-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Cuba's new government nationalized American-owned businesses and properties, established close relationships with the Soviet Union, and declared itself revolutionary and socialist. The Eisenhower administration and the CIA in particular viewed a communist-aligned government 90 miles from the coast of Florida as intolerable. The plan that was developed beginning in 1960 under Eisenhower and ultimately executed in April 1961 under the newly inaugurated John F. Kennedy was modeled on the success of PBSU success in Guatemala. A group of Cuban exiles would be trained and equipped by the CIA. They would land on Cuban soil, declare the existence of a popular uprising, and the Cuban military and public, so the theory went, would rally to them. Castro would be overthrown. Cuba would be restored to the Western camp. The man in charge of planning the operation was Richard Bissell, the same man who had overseen the U-2 program. His success with that technical program had given him and the CIA leadership enormous confidence in his judgment. That confidence was misplaced.
The planning for what became known as the Bay of Pigs operation was flawed in fundamental ways that were, in retrospect, obvious from the beginning. The assumption that ordinary Cubans would rise up against Castro in significant numbers was not supported by the available intelligence, which showed that Castro actually had substantial popular support. The assumption that the landing could be disguised as a spontaneous Cuban exile operation, not an American government project, was undermined by the fact that the preparations were being conducted at such a scale that they could not realistically be kept secret. Guatemala, Nicaragua, and other countries knew about the training camps. Cuban intelligence knew about the plan. News organizations knew about it and were holding the story largely as a courtesy to the administration. President Kennedy had inherited the operation from Eisenhower and was deeply ambivalent about it. He approved it with significant modifications, most notably the cancellation of planned airstrikes against Cuban military airfields that were supposed to neutralize Castro's air force before the landing. The CIA's planners believed these airstrikes were essential to the operation's success. Kennedy cancelled them out of concern for the optics of a visibly American military operation. The CIA's planners believed or convinced themselves that they could proceed without them. They were wrong.
On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. They were almost immediately in trouble. The Cuban military's response was faster and more organized than the CIA had predicted. The airstrikes that had been cancelled meant that Castro's planes survived and were able to sink the supply ships carrying the operation's ammunition and communications equipment. The expected popular uprising did not materialize. Within 3 days, the operation had collapsed completely. More than 100 of the exile fighters were killed. The remaining 1,189 were captured and ultimately ransomed back to the United States for approximately $53 million in food and medical supplies. Kennedy was furious. He privately told colleagues that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, though whether he ever said exactly those words in those exact formulations is disputed.
He accepted public responsibility for the failure, and his willingness to do so partly salvaged his public standing. But his relationship with the CIA was permanently damaged, and his suspicion of the agency's judgment, which had been limited before the Bay of Pigs, deepened considerably.
The CIA's internal post-mortem, conducted by then Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick, was a withering document that described the operation as characterized by arrogance, incompetence, and a systematic failure to honestly assess the operation's prospects. The report remained classified for decades. When it was finally released, its candor about institutional failure was striking. It documented the ways in which CIA officials had dismissed, ignored, and suppressed doubts about the plan, the ways in which the culture of the agency had made honest dissent nearly impossible, and the ways in which the confidence born of previous successes had blinded planners to the profound differences between Guatemala in 1954 and Cuba in 1961. The Bay of Pigs failure did not end the CIA's obsession with Castro. What followed was a decade of increasingly baroque attempts to assassinate him, many of them so improbable that they read today as dark comedy. Poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, a diving suit contaminated with a lethal skin disease. None of them succeeded. Castro lived until 2016, outlasting the CIA directors and American presidents who had wanted him dead by many decades. Section 9. Project Azorian, the most audacious intelligence operation ever attempted. Not all of the CIA's Cold War operations ended in embarrassment or moral failure. Some of them were extraordinary feats of ingenuity, daring, and technical ambition that have no parallel in the history of intelligence work. And perhaps none of them was more audacious, more technically improbable, or more carefully hidden from the world than Project Azorian. In February 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine designated K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean, approximately 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, at a depth of roughly 3 miles. All 98 crew members were lost. The Soviet Navy searched for the submarine for weeks but was unable to locate it. The Americans, who had been tracking Soviet submarine movements with their underwater hydrophone network, had a much better idea of where it had gone down. And what they quickly realized was that they were sitting on what might be the greatest intelligence prize in the history of the Cold War. A Soviet ballistic missile submarine at the bottom of the Pacific. Its nuclear missiles, its code books, its communications equipment, its cryptographic technology. The potential intelligence value was almost incalculable, and the Soviets, having failed to find it themselves, apparently had no idea that the Americans knew exactly where it was. The CIA, under Director Richard Helms and later William Colby, began planning what may have been the most expensive and technically complex covert operation in the agency's history, a mission to physically raise the submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean 3 miles down and recover its contents. The engineering challenge was staggering. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. The depths involved were extreme. The submarine itself was a large, heavy steel structure that had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for years. Raising it required equipment that did not yet exist. And the entire operation had to be conducted under absolute secrecy in the open ocean without the Soviets or anyone else realizing what was happening. The solution the CIA devised involved what has to be one of the most creative cover stories in intelligence history. They recruited the billionaire Howard Hughes, Already famous for his eccentricity and his involvement in various aerospace and ocean ventures, to provide the public face of what appeared to be a private deep-sea mining operation. A ship was secretly built at enormous expense, a vessel called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, outfitted with a giant mechanical claw system designed to descend to the ocean floor, grip the submarine, and raise it to the surface. The ship was presented to the world as a commercial deep-sea mineral extraction vessel. The operation took 6 years to plan and execute. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was deployed to the recovery site in the summer of 1974, ostensibly to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. Soviet intelligence vessels reportedly sailed nearby and observed the ship at work. They saw nothing that alarmed them. The cover story held. The mechanical claw descended. It gripped the submarine, and as it began to raise the massive structure toward the surface, something went wrong. The hull of the submarine, weakened by years at the bottom of the ocean, broke apart. Only about 1/3 of the forward section of the submarine was actually recovered. The portion containing the nuclear missiles and the most sensitive cryptographic equipment was lost back to the deep water. What was recovered was still significant. The CIA reportedly found 2 nuclear torpedoes, code books, and the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors, who were given a formal military burial at sea by the CIA. Declassified footage of that burial ceremony, conducted with genuine solemnity by the crew of the Glomar Explorer, is one of the stranger artifacts of the Cold War. It is not what you would expect from an organization conducting a covert intelligence operation, but there it is, CIA officers standing at attention as Soviet sailors were committed to the ocean. The operation was exposed in March 1975 when newspaper columnist Jack Anderson published the story after the Los Angeles Times had chosen not to print it. The CIA pressed news organizations not to publish, and several complied for a period. The full details remained classified for many years. The phrase "neither confirm nor deny" became standard CIA practice for responding to questions about sensitive operations, and its first prominent use is often traced to questions about the Glomar Explorer. Project Azorian has since been described by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers as the greatest marine engineering feat of the 20th century. The CIA itself describes it internally as one of its greatest intelligence successes, even accounting for the partial failure of the recovery. It is a remarkable story of what the CIA could accomplish when it applied its resources and its culture of ambitious problem-solving to a technically defined objective, one without the moral and political ambiguities that clouded so many of its other operations. Section 10. Chile and the Shadow of Allende. In September 1970, a physician and politician named Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile. He was the first democratically elected Marxist head of state in the Western Hemisphere. And within days of his election, the Nixon administration was consulting with the CIA about what to do about him. The Nixon administration's concern about Allende was not purely ideological, though the ideology mattered. It was also about concrete economic interests. American copper companies, including Anaconda and Kennecott, had significant holdings in Chile that Allende had pledged to nationalize. It was about strategic optics in Latin America, about the fear that a successful democratic socialist government in Chile might inspire similar movements elsewhere in the region. And it was about Nixon's and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's deep and visceral distaste for the idea of a Marxist government anywhere in the American sphere of influence.
Nixon's instructions to CIA Director Richard Helms, as Helms later recalled them, were blunt and sweeping. The president wanted to make the Chilean economy scream. He wanted to prevent Allende from being inaugurated, and if that failed, to create the conditions for his removal. He told Helms to play a trump card, to use $10 million or more if necessary to do whatever was needed.
The CIA's initial attempt to prevent Allende from taking office was an extraordinary episode. The agency attempted to organize a military coup to prevent Allende's inauguration, and as part of that effort, CIA-connected operatives participated in the assassination of Chile's Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General René Schneider, who was known to be committed to the constitutional process and was therefore an obstacle to the coup planning. Schneider was shot in October 1970 and died 3 days later. His death and the international outcry that followed actually made a pre-inauguration coup less likely rather than more. Allende was inaugurated in November 1970. What followed was a sustained 3-year covert campaign to destabilize his government. The CIA funneled money to Chilean opposition political parties, to newspapers hostile to Allende, to truckers' associations, and other organizations that could be used to create economic disruption through strikes. American financial institutions were encouraged to cut off credit to Chile. American officials worked to block international loans. The goal was to create economic chaos that would undermine public confidence in Allende's government and set the conditions for military intervention. On September 11, 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the Allende government. Allende died in the presidential palace during the coup, officially by suicide, though questions about the circumstances of his death have been raised over the years and debated by historians ever since. Thousands of Allende supporters were arrested in the days and weeks that followed. Many were tortured and killed. The National Stadium in Santiago was used as a detention and torture facility. The death toll from the Pinochet regime over the following years is estimated in the thousands, with thousands more forced into exile.
The CIA's precise role in the coup itself has been the subject of declassified documents and ongoing historical debate. What the documents make clear is that the CIA was deeply involved in creating the conditions that made the coup possible, through years of economic destabilization, support for opposition forces, and close relationships with elements of the Chilean military who opposed Allende. The extent to which CIA officers had advanced knowledge of the specific coup plans is less clearly established, though documents declassified in the late 1990s and early 2000s provide considerable detail about the agency's activities in the period leading up to the coup. Kissinger's response to questions about the moral dimension of American policy in Chile, delivered in 1975, became one of the most quoted and most criticized statements in the history of American foreign policy. He said that he didn't see why the United States had to stand by and let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. The assumption embedded in that statement that the United States had the right to override the democratic choices of another country's citizens when those choices conflicted with American interests captures something essential about the worldview that drove the CIA's covert action programs throughout the Cold War era. Section 11, The Church Committee, When the Secrets Came Out. The year 1975 was, for the CIA, something like an extended nightmare. It was the year that decades of accumulated secrets began to surface, one after another, in congressional hearing rooms and newspaper front pages, reshaping the public's understanding of what their intelligence agencies had been doing in their name. It began in December 1974, when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a major story in the New York Times describing a massive, illegal domestic surveillance operation that the CIA had conducted against American anti-war activists and other political dissidents. The program had a name, Operation Chaos, and it had compiled files on approximately 7,200 American citizens between 1967 and 1974, in direct violation of the CIA's prohibition on domestic operations. Hersh's story landed like a detonation. Congress responded. In January 1975, the Senate established a select committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee, as it became known, spent more than a year investigating CIA activities. What it found was staggering in its scope. The committee documented assassination plots against foreign leaders. The targets included Fidel Castro, on whom the CIA had spent years and enormous resources trying to find a workable method. The committee found evidence that the CIA had plotted against or been involved in actions against other foreign leaders as well. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, had been targeted for assassination in 1960. The CIA had actually prepared and sent a biological toxin to its station in the Congo for use against him, though Lumumba was ultimately killed by Congolese political rivals before the CIA's own plans could be executed. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic was assassinated in 1961, and while the CIA's direct role in his death was limited, the committee found that the agency had provided weapons to the Dominican dissidents who killed him. The committee also found that the CIA had been involved in the circumstances leading to the death of Chilean General René Schneider, as described earlier. The committee also exposed the full scope of MK-Ultra for the first time. CIA Director Turner's testimony about the program, described in the earlier section, came before this committee. The committee's findings about Operation Mockingbird, the infiltration of the American press, were equally disturbing to the public. Beyond specific programs, the Church Committee documented a broader culture within the CIA and the broader intelligence community of operating outside legal constraints, of treating the agency's mission as more important than the laws it was supposed to operate within, and of systematically deceiving the congressional oversight bodies that were supposed to provide accountability. Senator Church himself, in his opening statement, used a phrase that became one of the defining characterizations of the era's intelligence abuses. He described the CIA as a rogue elephant, an institution that had operated without adequate supervision or accountability. That phrase has been disputed by CIA veterans, who argue that the agency was always operating under presidential authority and was never truly out of control of the executive branch. The historical debate about which characterization is more accurate is genuinely complex, because the reality probably contains elements of both: an executive branch that authorized things it probably should not have, and an agency that had developed a culture of secrecy and self-justification that made honest accountability nearly impossible. The Church Committee's work led to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, to new executive orders restricting assassination plots and domestic surveillance, to the creation of permanent Senate and House Intelligence Oversight Committees, and to a period of genuine, if impermanent, reform in the intelligence community. The CIA emerged from the mid-1970s with its public reputation severely damaged, its internal culture unsettled, and a set of new legal and oversight constraints that would shape its operations for years.
What the Church Committee could not do, because the nature of its work was inherently limited, was uncover everything. It worked from documents the CIA chose to share, from testimony of witnesses who chose what to say. There were almost certainly programs, operations, and activities that the committee never reached.
The iceberg it described was real. The portion below the waterline remained invisible. Section 12. The Black Vaults. Spy planes, satellites, and the edge of the known. Not all of the CIA secrets are dark ones. Some of them are almost impossible to tell apart from science fiction. Achievements of engineering and ambition so extraordinary that when they were eventually declassified, many people had difficulty believing they were real. The U-2 spy plane, which Richard Bissell oversaw and which first flew in 1955, was one of the most significant technical achievements of the Cold War. Designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, the U-2 could fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far beyond the ceiling of any Soviet fighter aircraft of the era, and photographed enormous swaths of Soviet territory, with cameras capable of resolving objects just a few feet across from miles above the Earth. The intelligence it produced transformed American understanding of Soviet military capabilities, providing direct photographic evidence of the location and number of Soviet airfields, missile sites, and military installations that American planners had previously only been able to estimate. The U-2 was so secret that when Eisenhower was first briefed on it, he reportedly worried about what would happen if one was shot down. He was assured, incorrectly as it turned out, that a pilot who was downed at that altitude would not survive and would not be captured. The aircraft would be destroyed. The Americans would deny it was military. The cover story was that the U-2 was a weather research aircraft. The program was so secret that even most of the air bases from which the U-2 operated were hidden from normal channels. Detachments flew from Turkey, Pakistan, Norway, and Japan, among other locations, under cover stories designed to explain the unusual aircraft without revealing their true purpose. Pilots who flew the missions were technically civilians, formally resigned from the Air Force and hired by the CIA, so that if captured, the United States could maintain the fiction that the missions were not military operations. That fiction collapsed on May 1, 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union near the city of Sverdlovsk by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Powers survived, parachuted from the stricken aircraft, and was captured. The Eisenhower administration initially maintained the weather research cover story. The Soviets, who had recovered both the aircraft wreckage and the pilot, produced both in a press conference. The cover story collapsed spectacularly. The resulting diplomatic crisis cancelled a planned summit between Eisenhower and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and contributed to a significant deterioration in relations in the final year of Eisenhower's presidency. Powers was tried in the Soviet Union, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years. He was exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel in a bridge exchange in Berlin in 1962, one of the Cold War's more cinematically dramatic moments.
The successor to the U-2 was even more extraordinary. The A-12, which eventually became the SR-71 Blackbird, was a reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying at more than 3 times the speed of sound at altitudes approaching 90,000 feet. It could cross the continental United States in about an hour. It was designed to outrun surface-to-air missiles simply by going faster than anything fired at it could follow. It remains, decades after its operational service ended, one of the most breathtaking aircraft ever built, and its development under CIA auspices at the Skunk Works remains a masterclass in what can be achieved when an intelligence agency brings the best minds in the country to bear on a clearly defined technical problem. The Corona satellite program was another of these extraordinary achievements. Beginning in the late 1950s, the CIA worked with the Air Force to develop reconnaissance satellites capable of photographing Soviet territory from space and returning the film to Earth in small capsules that were caught in mid-air by specially equipped aircraft over the Pacific Ocean.
The first successful film recovery in August 1960 produced photographs covering a larger area of the Soviet Union than all previous U-2 missions combined. Corona ran until 1972 and produced an unprecedented archive of satellite photography that formed the backbone of American intelligence against Soviet capabilities for more than a decade. The program remained classified until 1995.
But not all of the CIA's unusual programs fall neatly into the category of engineering achievement. Beginning in the early 1970s, the CIA funded a research program at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, that investigated the possibility of remote viewing, the alleged ability of specially trained individuals to perceive distant locations using means that could not be explained by known physical principles. The program, which went through various names, including Stargate, Grill Flame, Center Lane, and others, ran for approximately 20 years and involved dozens of individuals who claimed various degrees of success in describing distant locations or objects without any conventional means of gaining information about them. The CIA's interest in this program was itself driven partly by reports that the Soviet Union was conducting similar research, applying the same Cold War logic that had driven MKUltra. If the enemy is doing it, we need to understand it and possibly do it better. The scientific community was and remains deeply skeptical of the program's results. A 1995 review by the American Institutes for Research concluded that while some results were statistically anomalous and could not easily be explained, the information produced was not sufficiently reliable to be operationally useful. The program was officially cancelled following that review. Whether any related research continued informally is not publicly known. There are also the UFO files. The CIA's interest in unidentified aerial phenomena goes back to the early 1950s, driven partly by genuine concern that unusual objects reported in American airspace might be Soviet reconnaissance technology, and partly by the recognition that public reports of unexplained phenomena needed to be explained in ways that did not compromise the U-2 and other classified programs. A significant portion of UFO sightings in the late 1950s and 1960s were, almost certainly, reports of classified American aircraft like the U-2, operating at altitudes that civilians at the time did not know any aircraft could reach. The CIA's role in managing public information about these sightings, including supporting explanations that were not entirely truthful, added another layer to the complicated story of the agency and the truth. The CIA declassified a large batch of UFO-related documents in the 1990s in response to congressional pressure. Those documents showed, among other things, that the agency had monitored public UFO reports for decades, had maintained relationships with key government officials dealing with the subject, and had, on multiple occasions, actively shaped the public narrative around aerial phenomena in ways that served the agency's interest in protecting classified programs. Whether the documents released in the 1990s represent the full extent of the CIA's interest in the subject is, like so many questions about the agency, genuinely unclear. Section 13. Post-9/11. Black Sites, Enhanced Interrogation, and the War on Terror.
The world changed on September 11, 2001. Everyone who was alive that day remembers where they were, what they were doing, the specific quality of the light and the air and the disbelief. And for the CIA, September 11 was not just a national tragedy, but an institutional earthquake.
The agency that had been created to prevent exactly this kind of surprise had failed to stop it. And in the furious, frightened months that followed, it was given extraordinary new authority to make sure it never happened again. There is a specific context to the CIA's failures before September 11 that the post-attack recriminations brought painfully into view. The agency had had intelligence that suggested Al-Qaeda was planning a major attack. It had been tracking two of the eventual hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midha, since a meeting in Malaysia in January 2000. It had, according to the 9/11 Commission's findings, failed to share critical information with the FBI and other agencies that might have triggered the kind of domestic surveillance that could have interrupted the plot. The reasons for those failures, whether they were institutional, procedural, cultural, or some combination of all three, were dissected exhaustively in the years after the attacks. The conclusions were not flattering. The CIA's expansion of covert authority in the years after 2001 was remarkable in its scope. The agency was authorized to conduct what were called enhanced interrogation techniques on captured terrorism suspects. It was authorized to operate a global network of secret detention facilities outside the United States and outside the oversight of most American legal structures. It was authorized to conduct drone strikes, killing individuals on the basis of intelligence assessments in countries with which the United States was not formally at war.
The legal scaffolding for these authorities was constructed largely in secret, in classified legal opinions produced by the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. The so-called torture memos, authored by lawyers including John Yoo and Jay Bybee, concluded that the enhanced interrogation techniques did not meet the legal definition of torture and therefore could be authorized without violating the Convention Against Torture or the relevant federal statutes. These conclusions were subsequently repudiated by the Obama administration, which withdrew the memos and declared that the techniques they authorized were in fact torture. The lawyers who wrote them, however, faced no professional discipline and no legal consequences. The enhanced interrogation program became one of the most controversial chapters in the CIA's history after 9/11. The techniques approved by the Justice Department under the George W. Bush administration included sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, confinement in small boxes, stress positions, facial slaps, and waterboarding, the simulation of drowning by strapping a person to a board, covering their face with cloth, and pouring water over it to trigger the drowning reflex. The CIA waterboarded 3 detainees, most notably Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the principal architect of the September 11 attacks, who was waterboarded 183 times by CIA officers. The CIA maintained that these techniques produced valuable intelligence that saved lives. Critics, including many career intelligence officers and virtually all serious academic researchers on interrogation, argued the opposite, that coercive interrogation techniques do not produce reliable intelligence because subjects under severe duress will say whatever they believe their interrogators want to hear rather than factual information, and that the techniques therefore produce a mixture of truth, fabrication, and what interrogators want to believe, which is extremely difficult to disentangle.
The black sites, the secret CIA detention facilities, operated in countries including Thailand, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and Afghanistan, housed detainees for periods ranging from months to years in conditions of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. Detainees were held without charge, without access to legal representation, and without notification to their families. Some of them were subjected to the enhanced interrogation techniques. Others were held in conditions that amounted to long-term psychological torture through isolation alone.
The existence of the black sites was not publicly acknowledged until President George W. Bush confirmed them in a speech in September 2006, at which point he announced that 14 high-value detainees were being transferred from the CIA program to military detention at Guantanamo Bay. The speech came after years of reporting by journalists including Dana Priest of The Washington Post, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the secret prison network, and after the European Union had opened investigations into whether CIA aircraft transporting detainees had transited through or used facilities in European countries.
The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence conducted a comprehensive investigation of the detention and interrogation program, producing a report that was completed in 2012 and partially declassified in 2014. The report's findings were stark. It concluded that the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques did not produce unique intelligence that could not have been obtained through other means. It documented numerous cases in which the CIA had misled Congress, the White House, and the Justice Department about what the program entailed and what it produced. It described acts of brutality that had not been authorized and had not been reported through proper channels. And it raised the fundamental question of whether the United States, in its response to terrorism, had itself crossed moral lines that could not be justified by any strategic calculus. The CIA disputed the report's findings vigorously. The debate between the Senate Committee's conclusions and the CIA's response continues. What is not disputed is that the program existed, that it involved the treatment of human beings in ways that the United States had historically characterized as torture when practiced by other governments, and that the legal frameworks created to authorize it represented one of the most significant expansions of executive power in American history. The drone program that grew alongside the detention program was in many ways even more consequential. CIA-operated drones conducted strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and other countries, killing hundreds of individuals designated as terrorism suspects or associates of terrorist organizations. The legal basis for strikes in countries with which the United States was not at war rested on classified legal opinions and national security determinations that were never subjected to public legal review. The accuracy of the targeting intelligence that determined who was a legitimate target and who was not has been contested, and credible reporting has documented significant numbers of civilian casualties. The CIA after 9/11 was not the same institution it had been in the Cold War. The scale of its operations, the nature of its authorities, and the directness of its lethal activities had all expanded substantially. The question of whether the post-9/11 CIA had sufficient oversight and whether its practices were consistent with the values it was ostensibly defending is one that serious people continue to debate without reaching easy conclusions. Section 14. The CIA and Silicon Valley, Tech, Data, and the Digital Shadow. There is a building in Arlington, Virginia, not far from CIA headquarters, that houses a company most people have never heard of. It's called In-Q-Tel. It was founded in 1999 at the CIA's initiative as a non-profit venture capital firm. Its mission is to identify, invest in, and accelerate the development of commercial technologies that have potential intelligence applications. It is, in essence, the CIA's investment arm in Silicon Valley, and its portfolio over the past 25 years reads like a map of the technologies that now define the modern world. The CIA's interest in commercial technology predates In-Q-Tel.
But the founding of the firm marked a formal recognition that the most important technologies for the future of intelligence would increasingly come not from government laboratories, but from private companies building products for commercial markets. The intelligence community needed a way to access and shape those technologies early, and In-Q-Tel was that way. The name itself is a deliberate reference. The Q in the James Bond films was the character who provided the spy with gadgets and technical tools. In-Q-Tel is, in its founder's framing, the real-world equivalent, the bridge between the intelligence community's requirements and the commercial technology sector's capabilities. The choice of that name was not accidental. It reflected a certain self-awareness and a certain pride in the role the CIA was carving out for itself in the emerging digital economy. Among In-Q-Tel's most consequential early investments was a company called Keyhole, Inc., which had developed technology for browsing satellite and aerial imagery in a three-dimensional interface. In-Q-Tel invested in Keyhole. Google subsequently acquired Keyhole in 2004. The technology became Google Earth. The relationship between the CIA's investment arm and Google's most visually striking product is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented business history, one that illustrates the porous and complex relationship between the intelligence community and the technology companies that now mediate enormous portions of human experience.
Palantir Technologies, the data analytics company founded in 2004 with early investment from Peter Thiel, also received early backing from In-Q-Tel. Palantir software, designed to integrate and analyze large data sets for intelligence and law enforcement purposes, has become one of the most widely used tools in the American intelligence and law enforcement community. Its founders have been candid about the company's origins in the intelligence community's needs. Its reach into government agencies, police departments, immigration enforcement, and other institutions has grown substantially over the years. The company takes its name from the all-seeing stones in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, objects that allowed their users to see events happening far away. The choice of name was deliberate and accurate. In-Q-Tel's broader portfolio has touched companies working in areas including geospatial analysis, document processing, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, and social media analysis. The pattern is consistent. Identify a technology being developed commercially for civilian purposes, invest early, ensure the intelligence community has access to the most advanced version of that technology, and benefit from the enormous resources and competitive pressures of the private market to drive the technology forward faster than any government program could on its own. The relationship between the CIA and the broader technology sector is not simply one of investment. It also involves the kinds of quiet information sharing arrangements, the requests for data access, the legal processes under which technology companies provide user information to intelligence agencies that were illuminated by Edward Snowden's disclosures about the National Security Agency in 2013. While the NSA, rather than the CIA, was at the center of those disclosures, the two agencies work closely together, and the legal and technological frameworks that govern intelligence access to commercial data apply to both. What these connections illustrate is something important about the CIA in the 21st century. The world of intelligence has always been about information, but in a world where the most consequential information is generated, stored, and processed by private commercial companies, where your location, your communications, your purchasing habits, your social relationships, and your daily movements are all captured in data held by corporations, the relationship between intelligence agencies and those corporations becomes one of the most consequential and least visible aspects of modern governance.
The CIA's digital activities are, by necessity, among its most classified. The agency has a significant cyber capability, about which relatively little is publicly known. The 2017 disclosure by WikiLeaks of a large archive of CIA documents describing hacking tools and techniques, a disclosure known as Vault 7, gave a glimpse into the agency's technical capabilities that the CIA had never intended to be public. The documents describe tools for compromising smartphones, smart televisions and computers, techniques for evading commercial antivirus software, and methods for conducting surveillance through devices that their owners believe to be off or secure. One of the more unsettling revelations in the Vault 7 documents was a program described as Weeping Angel, a joint project between the CIA and British intelligence that could turn a Samsung smart television into a covert listening device. The television would appear to be switched off while actually recording audio from the room it was in and transmitting that audio to CIA servers. The program was developed in 2014, well before smart televisions became ubiquitous fixtures in most homes. It was a reminder that the connected devices filling modern life, devices their owners think of primarily as entertainment and convenience, are also, from an intelligence perspective, potential surveillance platforms.
The CIA disputed the characterization of some of what was in those documents, but their authenticity was not seriously questioned, and they served as a reminder that in the 21st century, the tools of intelligence gathering have become entwined with the everyday devices of ordinary life in ways that raise questions that the democracy that created the CIA has not yet fully worked out how to answer.
Valerie Plame was a CIA operations officer whose identity was leaked to the press in 2003 in what a special prosecutor later determined was an act of political retaliation. Plame's husband, former diplomat Joseph Wilson, had written an op-ed in the New York Times challenging a key piece of the Bush administration's case for the invasion of Iraq, the claim that Iraq had sought to purchase uranium from Niger. Wilson had been sent to Niger by the CIA to investigate the claim and had reported back that it was almost certainly false. Shortly after his op-ed was published, Plame's CIA identity was disclosed in a newspaper column by Robert Novak, effectively ending her career as a covert officer. The disclosure of a covert CIA officer's identity is a federal crime under the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, the law signed by Ronald Reagan in 1982. A White House official named Scooter Libby was ultimately convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice in the investigation into the leak, though not of the leak itself. The Plame case illustrated something important about the relationship between intelligence agencies and the political structures they serve. The CIA had produced intelligence, through Wilson's mission, that complicated the case for a war the administration had decided to pursue. The response was not to engage with the intelligence on its merits, but to discredit the messenger, at the cost of exposing a covert officer. The message this sent through the CIA about what happened when intelligence contradicted political preferences was not a comfortable one.
Edward Snowden's relationship to the CIA is more complicated than his association primarily with the NSA suggests. Snowden worked for the CIA as a systems administrator and later as a contractor for NSA-affiliated programs. The programs he disclosed in 2013 included bulk collection of telephone metadata under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the PRISM program allowing NSA access to user data from major internet companies,
and various other surveillance programs of enormous scale. The legal and political debate those disclosures triggered is genuinely unresolved. Some view Snowden as a whistleblower who exposed genuine abuses of power. Others view him as a traitor whose disclosures damaged national security. He has lived in exile in Russia since 2013, granted permanent residency there after years of asylum. What the history of CIA-related whistleblowers and leaks illustrates is a structural tension at the heart of intelligence work in a democracy. The secrecy that makes intelligence work effective also makes it almost impossible to hold accountable through normal democratic mechanisms. Congressional oversight committees work in classified settings with incomplete information, reviewing programs that the executive branch has enormous incentives to characterize in the most favorable possible light. Courts cannot review most CIA activities because they cannot be told about them. The press cannot report on what it doesn't know. The result is that accountability, when it comes, often comes from people who decide that the rules are less important than the truth, who decide that the institution's secrets are less important than the public's right to know. Whether those people are heroes or traitors depends almost entirely on whether you think the secrets they revealed deserve to be revealed. And that question does not have a politically neutral answer.
The night is deep now. The world outside is quiet, and we find ourselves, after a long journey through decades and continents and classified programs, at the question that any honest account of the CIA must eventually arrive at. What don't we know? The answer, inevitably, is a great deal. The CIA continues to operate today as a substantial and sophisticated intelligence organization, with a workforce estimated at somewhere around 20,000 employees, a budget that is classified but estimated by various analysts to be in the vicinity of $15 billion annually as part of the broader National Intelligence Program budget, and an operational reach that spans virtually every country on Earth. It has adapted, as all institutions must, to the changes of the 21st century. The threats it monitors are different. The tools it uses are different. The context in which it operates is different.
The CIA's headquarters campus in Langley, Virginia, is itself a kind of monument to the institution's self-understanding. The main entrance hall has a quote from the Gospel of John inscribed in the marble wall, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." It is a striking choice of epigraph for an organization whose entire existence depends on secrecy. Whether that tension is ironic or earnest, whether it reflects genuine aspiration or a certain institutional cognitive dissonance, is something the people who work there have presumably thought about. The wall also contains the stars of the anonymous, 139 of them as of recent years, each representing a CIA officer who died in service. No names accompany most of the stars. The names are kept in a classified book of honor. Even in death, the secrecy holds. But the fundamental tensions that have defined the CIA since its founding have not been resolved. The tension between the need for secrecy and the requirements of democratic accountability. The tension between the short-term advantages of covert action and its long-term consequences. The tension between the ideals the agency claims to serve and the methods it sometimes uses to serve them. These tensions are not going away. They are structural features of what it means to maintain a secret intelligence service inside a democracy that values transparency and the rule of law. There are programs and operations in the CIA's current portfolio that will not be declassified for decades. There are operations from the Cold War era that have still not been fully described, despite 30 or 40 years of declassification efforts. There are entire categories of CIA activity in the realm of cyber operations, in the realm of technical collection, in the realm of covert action in the contemporary world, that are essentially invisible to the public and will remain so for the foreseeable future. There are also questions that the CIA's own history raises that have not been answered to anyone's satisfaction. What happened in the gap between the assassination plots that were documented by the Church Committee and the current executive orders officially prohibiting assassination? Are those orders absolute, or do they have exceptions? And if so, what are they? What happened with the programs that were supposedly terminated after the 1970s reforms? Were they really terminated, or were they restructured and relabeled? The history of the CIA contains enough examples of programs that were officially ended and then quietly continued, of oversight that were satisfied on paper while being circumvented in practice, of rules that turned out to have more elasticity than their language suggested, to make these questions genuinely worth asking. They are not questions born of paranoia. They are questions born of a careful reading of the documentary record. There is a concept used by intelligence analysts called an information gap, the space between what is known and what would need to be known for a complete picture to form. The CIA's public history is full of information gaps, and many of them may never close. The documents destroyed by Richard Helms in 1973 are gone permanently. The operations conducted in oral briefings without written records cannot be reconstructed. The agents who died without having told their stories took their knowledge with them. The information gap around the CIA is not merely large, it is, in several critical areas, deliberately unbridgeable. And then there are the truly unknown unknowns, the things that haven't surfaced yet in declassified documents or congressional testimonies or journalistic investigations, the operations and programs that exist only in files still locked in vaults that may not be opened for another generation. What did the CIA do in the decades between the Church Committee reforms and the post-9/11 expansion of its authorities? What was happening in the 1980s and 1990s in countries whose stories haven't yet been told? What technical programs, what covert operations, what surveillance activities are currently underway and will only become visible to the public long after the fact, when the decisions they shaped have already become history? There is also the question of the CIA's role in the proliferating world of information and disinformation, in an era when the tools of propaganda and influence have become enormously more powerful and enormously more accessible. Operation Mockingbird ran on bribery, persuasion, and the quiet placement of articles in newspapers. The tools available to intelligence agencies today for shaping information environments are incomparably more sophisticated. What the CIA's current role is in the broader landscape of information operations, online influence, and the management of public perception is a question that the public cannot fully answer because the relevant activities are, by definition, invisible. And yet there is something reassuring, in a strange way, about the fact that so much of what was once secret has eventually come to light. The Church Committee happened. The documents about Iran and Guatemala were eventually declassified.
The MK-Ultra records, even the ones that survived Helms's destruction order, eventually found their way into public view. The Senate Intelligence Committee report on the detention and interrogation program was, with redactions, released. The history of the CIA, however slowly and incompletely, has been a story of secrets that did not remain secret forever. That is not to minimize what was done in those secrets. The human cost of MK-Ultra was real. The lives destroyed by coups in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile were real. The people detained in black sites and subjected to enhanced interrogation were real people with real families. The journalists whose careers were used as instruments of CIA propaganda were real. These things happened, and the accounting for them, such as it has been incomplete and inadequate in proportion to the harm that was done.
But the fact that the accounting has happened at all, that the democracy has managed, imperfectly and belatedly, to look at some of what was done in its name, and to describe it and debate it, and occasionally to change course because of it, that is not nothing. It is not enough, but it is not nothing. The CIA exists because the world has not become the kind of place where it doesn't need to exist. Intelligence agencies are not aberrations in an otherwise transparent world. They are products of the world as it actually is, with its competition for power, its genuine threats, its irreducible asymmetries of information, its persistent willingness to use force and deception as tools of policy. Eliminating the CIA would not eliminate the world that makes it necessary. It would simply leave that world to be navigated without one of its tools, by a government that would need to create some other tool to take its place. What the history demands is not the elimination of the CIA, but the honest, ongoing, difficult work of accountability, of oversight, of insisting that the institution acknowledge what it has done and remain subject to the laws of the democracy it serves. That work is never finished. It is the kind of work that each generation has to recommit to, because each generation faces new pressures that make it tempting to decide that just this once the rules can be set aside for a sufficiently important reason. The files that are still locked away will open, slowly. The operations we don't know about will eventually surface, in the testimony of participants growing old, in the work of historians and journalists, in the slow turning of the declassification machinery. And when they do, they will add their chapters to a story that is still being written, the story of what a democracy chose to do in the shadows, and whether, when the light finally reached those shadows, it was possible to understand and live with what was found there. That is a question without a final answer. It is the kind of question that keeps you up at night, turning slowly through the possibilities, the probabilities, the known and the unknowable. And perhaps that is why it makes such good company in the dark. Think about it this way, if you can, before sleep takes you entirely. Somewhere tonight, in a building without a public address, someone is reading a report that the rest of us will not see for 30 years. Somewhere, a decision is being made in a room without windows that will shape events in a country most of us couldn't find on a map. And that shaping will ripple outward in ways that will only be understood decades from now. Somewhere, the institution we've been tracing all night through its history and its secrets is still operating, still gathering, still asking the questions that secret institutions ask.
And here you are, on the other side of that glass. In the warm dark, eyes heavy, breath slowing, the world turning quietly outside your window, full of things known and unknown, in equal and endless measure.
The CIA story, like all the best historical stories, has no true ending. It continues right now, in this very hour, in the same shadows where it has always lived. But that continuation is not your burden tonight. Tonight you can let the questions rest where they belong, in the patient archive of the past and the uncertain ledger of the future. You have traveled far tonight, through half a century of history that most people never get to sit with this slowly and this quietly. Let that be enough. Let the weight of it settle, not like worry, but like knowledge, like the satisfying heaviness of having understood something real. The world is very quiet now. The hour is late, and the story has traveled far, from the post-war corridors of Washington to the streets of Tehran, from a Montreal hospital to the floor of the Pacific Ocean, from Cold War Langley to the digital shadows of the present day. The CIA, with all its extraordinary history, its genuine achievements and its genuine crimes, its moments of daring ingenuity and its moments of catastrophic moral failure, is still there, still gathering, still analyzing, still operating in the spaces between what is known and what is not. And we are here, in the warm dark, at the edge of sleep, with the knowledge that the world is more complicated and more interesting than the surface suggests. That history is being made in rooms that won't be opened for decades. That the truth has a way of finding its path to the light, eventually, however long that eventually takes. Settle a little deeper into the quiet now. Let the weight of all that history rest where it belongs, not on your shoulders tonight, but in the long, slow archive of time. Close your eyes if they aren't already closed. Let the breath come slow and even. The questions will be there in the morning. The files will still be turning. The shadows will still hold their secrets for a while longer. For now, there is nothing required of you but rest. Sleep well. Thank you so much for listening all the way through to the end of tonight's journey. If this kind of slow, atmospheric history helps you drift off at night, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Heyo. My goal right now is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you genuinely matters to this channel. Leave me a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what the time is on your clock. If you have any sleepy hype left to send, I am always grateful for it. This channel exists because of the people who find it useful, and knowing that you're out there, drifting off somewhere in the world to the slow march of history means more than I can say. Until next time. Rest well, and wherever you are in the world, whatever the clock says on your wall, know that someone, right now, is keeping watch in the shadows. They always have been. They likely always will be. That is the world we live in. And somehow knowing that, you can still sleep.